Mafia King shot her 22 times and abandoned her. She came back as queen who destroyed his empire. This is the story of Selene Corleone, a woman who died in a hail of bullets and was reborn as the most dangerous force the underworld had ever seen. And before we dive into how she turned her betrayal into the most devastating revenge in Mafia history, hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Stella's Love Tales, where power meets passion and revenge is always served ice cold. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from because I love connecting with you all. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now because you're about to witness a transformation so brutal and beautiful it'll leave you breathless. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. 22 bullets tore through Selene Corleone's body on a rain-soaked night in the warehouse district, each one fired by the hand of Dante Drago, the Mafia king she had loved with every fiber of her being, the man who had whispered promises of forever against her skin just hours before. He decided she knew too much, had seen too much, had become too dangerous to his empire. And as she lay bleeding out on that cold concrete floor, watching his taillights disappear into the darkness, her last conscious thought wasn't of the pain radiating through her shattered ribs, or the blood pooling beneath her, or even the betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. It was a single word that burned itself into her dying brain like a brand: vengeance. The doctors at St. Catherine's Emergency couldn't explain how she survived. How a woman with 22 entry wounds, 3 collapsed lungs, a shattered spine, and a heart that had technically stopped beating for 4 minutes and 37 seconds could open her eyes 3 weeks later and ask not where am I, or what happened, but where is he? Her voice nothing but gravel and rage, her eyes holding something the trauma surgeon would later describe in his private notes as inhuman focus. Because Selene Corleone didn't just survive that night in the warehouse. She died there, and what crawled out of that hospital bed 6 months later, wearing her face, was something else entirely. Something forged in gunfire and abandonment, and the kind of fury that doesn't just want revenge, but needs it like oxygen. Dante Drago ruled the eastern seaboard's underground with an iron fist and a reputation for ruthlessness that made grown men cross themselves when his name was mentioned. His empire built on fear and blood and the bodies of anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. And for 2 years after he pulled that trigger, he slept soundly in his penthouse fortress, believing Selene was rotting in an unmarked grave somewhere, never knowing she was watching him from the shadows, learning every detail of his operation, identifying every weakness in his armor, befriending his enemies, seducing his allies, and systematically building her own power base with the single-minded determination of someone who had already died once and had nothing left to lose. She started small, taking over his drug distribution in the Port District by offering his dealers better terms and protection from his own enforcers, then moved to his gambling operations by exposing his rigged games to the families who'd been losing fortunes at his tables, then his weapons trafficking by intercepting his shipments and selling them to his competitors at half price. Each move calculated to hurt him financially while building her own war chest. And within 18 months, she had carved out her own territory right in the heart of his empire. A shadow kingdom he didn't even know existed until it was too late. The night Dante Drago finally learned that Selene Corleone was alive, he was sitting in his private club surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants, when the lights cut out and a single spotlight illuminated a woman standing in the doorway, wearing a crimson dress that matched the blood he'd spilled, a crown of white gold and diamonds resting on her dark hair, and a smile that promised the kind of pain that makes death look like mercy. And in that moment, watching recognition and then terror flood his eyes as he realized the ghost he'd created had come home. Selene felt the first spark of satisfaction she'd experienced since those 22 bullets had torn through her flesh. "Hello, Dante," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room like a death sentence. "Did you miss me?" And before he could reach for the gun at his hip, before his men could move, before he could process that his greatest mistake was standing in front of him, very much alive, and very much ready to destroy everything he'd ever built. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers, and every single one of his lieutenants, the men he'd trusted with his life, his secrets, his empire, turned their guns on him because Selene Corleone hadn't just survived. She'd spent 2 years turning his own people against him. And now, finally, the real game could begin. Selene Corleone's deepest desire wasn't just revenge. It was to make Dante Drago feel every ounce of the abandonment that had flooded through her veins as she lay dying on that warehouse floor. To strip away everything he valued, the way he'd stripped away her trust, her love, her very humanity, with those 22 bullets. Because the woman she'd been before that night, the woman who'd believed in loyalty and honor and the sanctity of the bond they'd shared, that woman had died in a pool of her own blood. And what remained was something colder, sharper, more dangerous than Dante could possibly imagine, driven not by hot rage, but by the ice-cold calculation of someone who'd spent 6 months in a hospital bed with nothing to do but plan the systematic destruction of the man who'd tried to erase her from existence. Her right-hand man was Victor Bourne, a former British intelligence operative who'd gone rogue after his own government had betrayed him, leaving him to rot in a black site prison until Selene had orchestrated his escape in exchange for his absolute loyalty. And Victor brought something to her operation that Dante's thugs could never match: sophistication, strategic thinking, and a network of international contacts who could move money, weapons, and information across borders without leaving a trace. Plus, he understood her in a way no one else could, because he too had been abandoned by people he'd trusted, left for dead by an institution he'd served faithfully, and that shared wound created a bond deeper than mere employment, a partnership built on mutual understanding of what it meant to be betrayed by those you'd loved. Then there was Isabella Gatsby, Dante's own cousin and the family's financial genius, a woman who'd spent 15 years managing the Drago Empire's legitimate business fronts while secretly despising her cousin's brutality and the way he'd murdered her brother 5 years ago over a perceived slight, making it look like a rival family's hit. And Selene had found her through careful research, approached her not with threats, but with evidence of Dante's betrayal, photographs and recordings that proved he'd killed his own blood. And Isabella's conversion to Selene's cause had been instant and absolute, because she'd been waiting years for someone strong enough to challenge Dante, someone ruthless enough to actually win. And now she fed Selene every financial detail of the Drago Empire, every hidden account, every shell corporation, every weakness in the money laundering operation that kept Dante's criminal enterprise running. The emotional stakes were staggering, because Selene wasn't just fighting to destroy an empire. She was fighting to prove that the woman Dante had thrown away like garbage was worth more than everything he'd built. That his greatest mistake wasn't pulling the trigger, but underestimating her capacity to survive, to adapt, to become something more terrifying than he'd ever been. And every night when she looked in the mirror at the scars those 22 bullets had left across her torso, she didn't see weakness or vulnerability. She saw a map of her resurrection, physical proof that she'd conquered death itself, and if she could survive that, there was nothing Dante could do to stop what was coming. But beneath the ice-cold vengeance and the strategic brilliance, Selene harbored a secret fear that even Victor and Isabella didn't know about. She was terrified that when this was all over, when Dante's empire lay in ruins, and he was broken at her feet, she would feel nothing, that the woman capable of love and joy and genuine human connection had truly died in that warehouse, and all that would remain was this hollow instrument of revenge. And sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, she wondered if destroying Dante meant destroying the last piece of herself that remembered what it felt like to be human, to trust, to love without calculation. But she pushed those thoughts away because there was no going back. No path to redemption that didn't run straight through the heart of Dante Drago's empire. Victor noticed the moments when her mask slipped, when the ruthless queen showed glimpses of the wounded woman underneath, and he worried about what would happen to her when the revenge was complete, whether she'd be able to find peace, or if she'd become addicted to the game of power and destruction. But he kept those concerns to himself because Selene needed him to be strong, to be the steady hand that never questioned her decisions. And besides, he understood better than anyone that some betrayals carved wounds so deep that revenge wasn't a choice but a necessity, the only path to any kind of closure. Isabella, meanwhile, saw in Selena something she'd never seen in any member of the Drago family: genuine strategic genius combined with emotional intelligence, the ability to inspire loyalty not through fear, but through respect and shared purpose. And she began to wonder if Celine's endgame was bigger than just destroying Dante. If perhaps she intended to take his place and rebuild the Empire into something less monstrous, something that didn't devour its own children. And that possibility excited Isabella more than she wanted to admit, because she'd spent her entire adult life watching her family's power corrupt absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, Selene Corleone could break that cycle. If you're loving this transformation from victim to queen, drop a comment below and tell me what you think Selene should do to Dante when she finally has him at her mercy. And make sure you're subscribed, because this revenge story is about to get even more intense. The central challenge arrived not in the form Selene expected, but through a man she never saw coming: Alessandro Kane, Dante's new security consultant, a former FBI agent who'd been forced out of the bureau for getting too close to exposing corruption at the highest levels, and who now sold his expertise to the highest bidder. And the moment he walked into that club and locked eyes with Selene across the room, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before those 22 bullets tore through her flesh. Genuine fear, because Alessandro Kane had a reputation for being utterly incorruptible, impossible to bribe or seduce or threaten, and his specialty was finding ghosts, uncovering the hidden players who thought they were untouchable, which meant he was exactly the kind of threat who could unravel everything she'd built before she was ready to strike. Dante had hired Alessandro specifically because his empire was hemorrhaging money and power to an unknown enemy, someone who seemed to anticipate his every move, who had turned his own people against him, who operated with a level of sophistication that suggested either a rival family with unlimited resources or something far more personal. And Alessandro's first assessment had been brutally honest. You have a ghost in your operation, someone who knows you intimately, someone with a vendetta, and they're not going to stop until you're destroyed. Words that had sent ice through Dante's veins, because he'd made so many enemies over the years, killed so many people, betrayed so many allies, that narrowing down who wanted him dead most was nearly impossible. But Alessandro Kane wasn't just a threat to Selene's plans. He was something far more dangerous. He was fascinating, with sharp green eyes that seemed to see through every mask she wore, a quiet intensity that matched her own, and a moral code that was somehow both rigid and flexible, principled but not naive. And when he approached her at the bar after Dante's lieutenants had escorted their boss to safety, when he leaned in close enough that she could smell his cologne and said, "I know you're not who you're pretending to be, and I'm going to figure out exactly what game you're playing," she felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the electric charge of meeting someone who could actually challenge her, who saw her not as a pawn or a victim, but as a worthy opponent. The crucial decision came 3 days later, when Alessandro showed up at the gallery opening, where Selene was posing as an art investor, cornering her in front of a painting of Medusa turning men to stone. And he laid out everything he'd discovered: her real identity, her connection to Dante, the timeline of her supposed death and miraculous resurrection, though he admitted he couldn't yet prove she was behind the systematic dismantling of the Drago Empire. And then he made an offer that stopped her heart. Work with me. Tell me everything you know about Dante's operation. Help me bring him down through legal channels, and I'll make sure you get justice without becoming the monster he is. And Selene had to make a split-second choice between eliminating this threat, trying to recruit him to her cause, or doing something she'd never considered, trusting someone new with the truth of who she'd become. The first major plot twist came when Selene, instead of lying or threatening or trying to seduce Alessandro into compliance, did something that shocked even herself. She laughed, a genuine sound of dark amusement that made him take a step back, and she said, "You think legal justice can touch a man like Dante Drago? You think courts and evidence and due process matter to someone who's bought half the judges in the city and killed the other half's families? I died for him, Alessandro. I felt 22 bullets tear through my body because I loved him, and he decided I was disposable. And you want me to trust the same system that's been protecting him for 2 decades?" And she pulled up her shirt just enough to show him the constellation of scars across her abdomen, physical proof of her resurrection, and watched his face transform from professional detachment to genuine horror, to something that looked dangerously like admiration. Alessandro Kane made his own crucial decision in that moment, one that would change everything. Instead of reporting back to Dante about the ghost he'd found, instead of trying to stop Selene, or arrest her, or expose her to the authorities, he said 5 words that shifted the entire game. "Then let me help you." And Selene felt something crack in the ice around her heart. Because this man, this incorruptible former agent who'd built his entire identity on playing by the rules, was offering to throw away everything he believed in to help her get the revenge that the law never could. And she didn't know if he was falling for her, or if he simply recognized that some betrayals were so profound that they transcended legal justice. But either way, she now had to decide whether to trust him or kill him, whether to let someone see the full extent of her pain and rage, or maintain the perfect mask of the untouchable queen. What do you think? Can Selene trust Alessandro, or is he playing a deeper game? Drop your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because this alliance is about to make Dante's nightmare so much worse. Selene's decision to trust Alessandro Kane came with conditions that would test whether his offer was genuine or just another elaborate trap. She demanded he prove his loyalty by feeding Dante false information about the ghost's identity, pointing suspicion toward the Rousseau family who'd been trying to move into Dante's territory for years. And Alessandro agreed without hesitation, which should have reassured her, but instead made her more suspicious because men didn't just abandon their principles overnight. Not even for a woman with scars that told a story of resurrection and revenge. Their first real collaboration happened in Alessandro's downtown loft, where he'd set up a command center, tracking every aspect of Dante's operation. And as Selene walked through his evidence boards, covered in photographs and financial records and surveillance reports, she realized with growing unease that Alessandro had been hunting her specifically for weeks, that he'd identified her as the ghost before their encounter at the club, which meant his approach had been calculated, strategic, and she couldn't tell if that made him more trustworthy or more dangerous. But when she confronted him about the deception, he met her eyes and said, "I needed to see if you were driven by justice, or just bloodlust, and the way you talked about those 22 bullets, the way you showed me your scars instead of hiding them, told me everything I needed to know about who you really are." The romantic tension between them grew through late-night strategy sessions, where Alessandro would challenge her plans, forcing her to think 3 steps ahead, to consider consequences she'd been too focused on revenge to see, and Selene found herself both infuriated and intrigued by his refusal to simply follow orders, by the way he treated her as an equal partner rather than a queen to be obeyed. And there were moments when their hands would brush over the same document, or their eyes would lock across the table, and she'd feel that dangerous pull towards something that wasn't part of the plan, something that made her vulnerable in ways even Dante's bullets hadn't managed. Victor Bourne didn't trust Alessandro at all, saw him as a potential threat who could be playing both sides, and his concerns weren't entirely unfounded, because Alessandro was still technically on Dante's payroll, still filing reports and attending meetings, and maintaining his cover as the loyal security consultant, which created a dangerous game where one wrong move could expose everything. And Victor made his position clear during a tense confrontation in Selene's penthouse. He's FBI, Selene. They don't just stop being FBI. And the moment he decides his conscience matters more than whatever he feels for you, he'll burn us all to protect his precious moral code. Words that planted seeds of doubt she couldn't entirely dismiss. The first major obstacle came when Dante, acting on Alessandro's false intelligence about the Russo family, launched a preemptive strike that resulted in the deaths of 3 Russo soldiers and ignited a gang war that Selene hadn't anticipated, and suddenly the city was burning with violence she'd indirectly caused, innocent people caught in crossfire between families. And Alessandro looked at her with something that might have been disappointment, or might have been a test, and asked, "Is this the justice you wanted? Because it looks a lot like the chaos Dante creates." And Selene had to confront the uncomfortable truth that revenge wasn't clean, that destroying Dante meant collateral damage she'd convinced herself she could accept, but now had to actually witness. Isabella Gatsby provided a crucial piece of information that shifted everything. She'd discovered that Dante had a secret daughter, a 12-year-old girl named Sophia, living in Switzerland under an assumed identity with a woman Dante had loved before his marriage, before his descent into the brutality that defined him now. And this revelation created a moral dilemma that tested the very foundation of Selene's revenge, because she could use Sophia as leverage, could threaten the one thing Dante actually loved more than power, but doing so would make her exactly the kind of monster who'd put 22 bullets in someone they claimed to love. Alessandro saw her wrestling with this decision and did something unexpected. He took her hand, the first time they'd touched with genuine intimacy rather than accidental contact, and he said, "The fact that you're struggling with this, that you see this child as a line you might not want to cross, that's how I know you're not him. That's how I know there's still something worth saving in you." And Selene felt tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry since the warehouse, felt the ice around her heart crack just a little more, and she realized with terrifying clarity that Alessandro Kane was becoming the thing she'd sworn she'd never have again. Someone who could hurt her, someone whose opinion mattered, someone who made her want to be better than the weapon she'd forged herself into. The tension reached a breaking point when Dante, growing paranoid about the ghost and suspicious of everyone around him, ordered Alessandro to prove his loyalty by personally executing a suspected traitor. And Alessandro had 48 hours to either commit murder to maintain his cover or risk exposure that would destroy everything Selene had built. And she had to decide whether to pull him out, whether to sacrifice months of planning to save a man she'd known for weeks, whether the growing feelings between them were worth more than the revenge she'd literally died for. Tell me in the comments, should Selene save Alessandro or stay focused on destroying Dante? And subscribe, because the next part is where everything explodes. The game-changing twist came not from Dante's world, but from Alessandro's past. When a woman named Dr. Elena Volkov walked into Selene's penthouse unannounced, bypassed all of Victor's security with credentials that suggested government clearance at the highest levels, and introduced herself as Alessandro's former partner at the FBI, the one who'd been investigating the Drago family with him 5 years ago, the one who'd supposedly died in a car accident that everyone assumed was Dante's work, except she was very much alive and had information that would shatter everything Selene thought she knew about the man she was starting to trust. Elena revealed that Alessandro Kane wasn't forced out of the FBI for getting too close to exposing corruption. He'd been placed on administrative leave for becoming obsessed with bringing down Dante Drago after the crime boss had ordered a hit that killed Alessandro's younger sister, a prosecutor who'd been building a RICO case against the family, which meant Alessandro's offer to help Selene wasn't about justice, or attraction, or moral flexibility. It was about revenge, just as personal and consuming as her own. And suddenly, every moment of connection between them felt like a lie, built on shared trauma rather than genuine feeling. But Elena's revelation went deeper and darker than simple motivation. She explained that Alessandro had been working a long-term undercover operation for the past 3 years, one that the FBI officially denied existed, one where he was supposed to infiltrate Dante's organization and gather evidence for a federal takedown, which meant every piece of information Selene had shared with him, every strategy they'd developed together, every vulnerable moment where she'd let him see her scars and her pain, had potentially been recorded and reported to handlers who could use it to destroy her right alongside Dante. And the betrayal cut deeper than those 22 bullets, because at least Dante had shot her in the front. At least she'd seen that betrayal coming. Selene confronted Alessandro in his loft with Victor's gun pressed against his spine and murder in her eyes, demanded to know if anything between them had been real, or if she'd been just another asset to manipulate, another tool in his quest for revenge against the man who'd killed his sister. And Alessandro did something that either proved his sincerity or demonstrated masterful manipulation. He didn't deny Elena's accusations, didn't try to explain away the undercover operation, or claim he'd gone rogue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed Selene every report he'd filed with his FBI handlers over the past 3 months. Reports that mentioned a ghost operative, but deliberately obscured her identity. That provided just enough information to maintain his cover, but protected her from federal investigation. And then he did something that changed everything. He called his handler on speakerphone and quit, officially and irrevocably, burned every bridge back to his old life, while Selene listened in stunned silence. The romantic connection deepened through shared vulnerability when Alessandro, after ending his FBI career to prove his loyalty, finally broke down and told Selene about his sister Maria, about how she'd been 26 years old with a brilliant legal mind and a passion for justice, about how Dante had her car rigged with explosives that detonated on a sunny Tuesday morning while Alessandro was on the phone with her discussing their mother's birthday plans, about how he'd heard the explosion through the phone and spent 3 years building a case that kept getting blocked by corruption at every level, until he realized the only way to get justice was to become the kind of person who operated outside the law. And Selene saw her own pain reflected in his eyes, understood that they were both ghosts haunted by the people they'd been before Dante Drago destroyed their lives. But the revelation that truly shifted everything came from an unexpected source. Isabella Gatsby had been digging into Selene's own past, trying to understand the woman she'd helped resurrect, and she discovered something in the hospital records from the night of the shooting that Selene herself didn't know. She'd been 12 weeks pregnant when Dante put those 22 bullets in her, and the medical team had tried desperately to save the baby, but couldn't, which meant Dante hadn't just tried to kill Selene. He'd murdered their unborn child, a child he never knew existed, because Selene had been planning to tell him that night, had been waiting for the perfect moment to share the news that would have changed everything. And this revelation transformed her revenge from personal vendetta into something far more primal and absolute. Because now she wasn't just avenging her own death. She was avenging the future that had been stolen, the child who never got to take a first breath, the family that could have been. Alessandro held Selene while she processed this devastating truth, while she screamed and cried, and finally allowed herself to fully feel the magnitude of what Dante had taken from her. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, when all her masks had shattered and all her carefully constructed walls had crumbled, Alessandro kissed her with a desperation that matched her own, and she kissed him back. Not because it was strategic or part of any plan, but because they were two broken people who understood each other's darkness, who'd both lost everything to the same monster, and maybe together they could become something more than the sum of their traumas. The stakes reached their highest point when Victor burst in with news that Dante had discovered Alessandro's betrayal, that he'd ordered both of them killed, and that they had maybe 6 hours before the entire Drago family came hunting for the ghosts who'd been destroying their empire from within. Drop your reactions in the comments and smash that subscribe button, because the next part is where Selene and Alessandro go from hunted to hunters. The breaking point came faster than anyone anticipated when Dante's enforcers ambushed Victor's safe house at dawn, a coordinated strike that suggested someone inside Selene's inner circle had betrayed them. And in the chaos of gunfire and explosions, Victor took 3 bullets protecting Selene's escape route, went down hard with blood spreading across his chest, and his last words before losing consciousness were, "Finish it, boss. Make it mean something." Which left Selene with the horrifying realization that the man who'd been her rock, her protector, her only link to the person she'd been before the warehouse, might die because she'd dragged him into her war. Alessandro made the impossible choice to stay behind and cover their retreat, told Selene to run while he held off Dante's soldiers, and she watched through tears as he fired his last rounds and then disappeared into smoke and chaos. And she didn't know if he was captured or killed, but either option meant she'd lost the only person who'd understood her darkness, who'd seen all her scars and still chosen to stand beside her, and the separation felt like those 22 bullets all over again, except this time she was conscious for every moment of the pain. Isabella Gatsby went dark completely, all communication channels silent, which meant either she'd been compromised or she'd decided the risk of association with Selene was too high. And without Isabella's intelligence network, Selene was operating blind. Didn't know where Dante was hiding. Didn't know which of her remaining allies could be trusted. Didn't know if Alessandro was even still alive, or if she was truly alone again, just like she'd been in that warehouse bleeding out on cold concrete. The seemingly insurmountable obstacle revealed itself when Selene, desperate and running out of options, reached out to her one remaining contact in Dante's organization, only to discover that Dante had anticipated every move she'd made, had known about her resurrection for weeks, had been playing along and feeding her false victories while systematically dismantling her support network, and the contact delivered Dante's message with cruel satisfaction. He says to tell the ghost that he's impressed by her performance, that watching her think she was winning has been the most entertainment he's had in years, and that he's ready to finish what he started in the warehouse. Except this time, he'll make sure she stays dead. Selene's deepest fear manifested when she received a video message showing Alessandro chained in what looked like the same warehouse where she died, beaten and bloodied, but still alive, and Dante's voice narrated over the footage. "Your FBI boyfriend has been very entertaining, Selene. Yes, I know who you really are. I've always known. Did you think I wouldn't recognize my own wife, even with the scars? I let you play your little revenge game because I wanted to see how far you'd go. Wanted to see if the woman I loved was still in there somewhere, or if I'd successfully killed her that night. And now I have my answer. You're exactly the monster I made you, and I'm going to enjoy breaking you all over again. But first, I'm going to make you watch while I put 22 bullets in your new lover. One for each bullet you survived. Poetic, don't you think?" The situation appeared completely hopeless when Selene realized that Dante had orchestrated everything from the beginning, that her resurrection and revenge had been nothing but theater, for his amusement, that he'd allowed her to think she was the hunter when she'd always been the prey, and the crushing weight of that manipulation, of knowing that every victory had been a gift from the man who'd murdered her and their unborn child, broke something fundamental in her spirit that even the warehouse shooting hadn't managed to destroy. She confronted her own reflection in a broken mirror of an abandoned building where she'd gone to hide, saw the scars that covered her body, the hardness in her keys that hadn't been there before Dante, and she had to face the terrifying question of whether she'd become so consumed by revenge that she'd lost the part of herself worth saving. whether Alessandro had been wrong to see anything redeemable in her, whether she was just another monster in a city full of monsters, and her quest for justice had been nothing but dressed-up bloodlust all along. The desperation reached its peak when Selene received a second message from Dante, with coordinates and a deadline. She had 12 hours to come to the warehouse alone and unarmed, to kneel before him and beg for Alessandro's life. And if she complied, he'd kill her quickly and let Alessandro live. But if she tried any tricks, if she brought backup or weapons, or attempted another one of her clever plans, he'd torture Alessandro for days, while forcing her to watch before killing them both. And Selene had to decide whether to sacrifice everything she'd built, all her plans for revenge and justice, to save the man she'd fallen for, or whether to let Alessandro die and continue her mission alone, and either choice felt like losing. Felt like Dante winning no matter what she decided. Victor remained in critical condition at an underground clinic. Isabella was missing and presumed compromised. Alessandro was captured and being used as bait. And Selene sat alone in the darkness with a single bullet in her gun and 11 hours until Dante's deadline. And for the first time since crawling out of her grave, she genuinely didn't know if she had the strength to keep fighting. Didn't know if revenge was worth the cost of everyone she'd started to care about. Didn't know if she was the queen who destroyed Dante's empire, or just another victim waiting to die. Comment below if you think Selene should sacrifice herself for Alessandro, and subscribe because the next part is where everything changes. The spark of hope came from the most unexpected source when Isabella Gatsby emerged from the shadows, not as a traitor, but as someone who'd gone deep undercover into Dante's inner circle, had allowed herself to be captured, to gain access to information that would change everything. And she appeared at Selene's hideout, with bruises on her face that were real and intelligence that was invaluable. Dante's entire operation was built on a foundation of lies. His empire held together by blackmail files stored in a single location. And if those files were destroyed or exposed, every corrupt official, every dirty cop, every compromised judge who protected him would turn on him instantly to save themselves. Selene found her inner strength in the most unlikely moment when she visited Victor in the underground clinic and found him conscious despite his injuries. And he grabbed her hand with surprising force and said, "I didn't take 3 bullets so you could give up now. I took them because I believe in the woman who crawled out of her own grave, who turned pain into power, who showed me that surviving isn't the same as living. And you're going to finish this, not because Dante deserves to die, but because you deserve to live. Really live, not just exist as a ghost haunted by what he took from you." The crucial realization hit Selene like lightning when she reviewed everything she knew about Dante's psychology, about the man she'd once loved before he became a monster, and she understood that his entire elaborate game of letting her think she was winning wasn't about entertainment or cruelty. It was about his desperate need to prove that she'd loved him once, that the woman who'd promised forever hadn't been destroyed by his bullets, that somewhere beneath her scars and rage, the Selene who'd chosen him still existed, which meant his weakness wasn't his daughter Sophia, or his empire, or his pride. It was his pathological need for Selene to acknowledge that what they'd had was real, that he'd destroyed something genuine, rather than just eliminating a liability. Isabella revealed the key to solving everything when she explained that Dante's deadline wasn't random, that in exactly 12 hours, he had a meeting with the 5 family heads who controlled organized crime across the eastern seaboard. A meeting where he planned to consolidate power by showing them he'd eliminated the ghost who'd been destabilizing his operation, which meant if Selene could turn his victory parade into a public humiliation, if she could expose his vulnerabilities in front of the people whose respect maintained his power, she wouldn't just destroy Dante, she'd dismantle the entire system that had protected him. The romantic reunion happened not in the warehouse where Dante expected, but through a daring rescue operation that Selene planned with military precision using Isabella's inside knowledge to infiltrate Dante's stronghold through underground tunnels that dated back to Prohibition. And when Selene found Alessandro chained and beaten, but still defiant, still refusing to give Dante the satisfaction of breaking, she cut through his restraints and whispered, "I'm not here to beg for your life. I'm here because queens don't abandon their kings, and together we're going to burn his empire to the ground." And Alessandro kissed her with a desperation that spoke of how close he'd come to losing hope. How her arrival wasn't just a rescue, but a resurrection of faith in something bigger than revenge. Their deeper understanding came during the escape, when Alessandro, limping and bleeding, but refusing to slow down, told Selene that being tortured by Dante had given him clarity about what mattered, that he'd realized revenge was just another form of chains, that the only way to truly beat Dante was to become something he could never understand or control, to choose love and life and future over the past that haunted them both. And Selene understood that Alessandro wasn't asking her to give up her mission, but to transform it, to make it about building something new, rather than just destroying something old. Victor's contribution came through a recorded message he'd prepared before the ambush. Insurance he'd kept hidden even from Selene. A confession from one of Dante's former enforcers detailing every murder, every crime, every corrupt deal that had built the Drago Empire. Testimony that would hold up in court and couldn't be dismissed as the ravings of a vengeful ex-wife. And suddenly Selene had the weapon she needed, not just for revenge, but for justice, the kind that would put Dante in prison for life, rather than just in the ground. The final confrontation setup crystallized when Selene realized she didn't need to go to Dante's warehouse alone and defeated. She needed to crash his meeting with the 5 families as the queen she'd become, needed to walk in with Alessandro at her side, and Victor's evidence in her hand, and Isabella's intelligence guiding her moves, needed to show Dante and everyone who'd underestimated her that the woman he'd shot 22 times hadn't just survived. She'd evolved into something far more dangerous than he'd ever been. Someone who understood that real power wasn't about fear and bullets. It was about truth and courage, and the determination to stand up, even when standing meant risking everything all over again. Selene looked at her team, this unlikely family she'd built from the ashes of her old life, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before the warehouse. Something that felt dangerously like hope, like the possibility that maybe revenge could transform into justice, that maybe destroying Dante's empire could be the first step toward building something better. And she smiled for the first time in 3 years and said, "Let's go remind a Mafia king why you should never leave your queen for dead." Drop your predictions for the final confrontation in the comments, and subscribe because the next part is where Selene becomes the queen who destroys everything. Selene walked into the 5 families meeting, not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror, wearing a blood-red dress that matched the scars she no longer bothered to hide, with Alessandro at her right side, looking like the avenging angel he'd become, and Isabella at her left, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would topple empires. And the shock on Dante's face when she entered the private room at his flagship casino was worth every bullet she'd survived, every moment of pain she'd endured, every night she'd spent planning this exact moment. The confrontation began with Dante trying to maintain control, standing up and addressing the 5 family heads with forced confidence. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. This is my late wife, who seems to have forgotten that dead women should stay buried. But I assure you, I'll handle this domestic situation quickly." But Selene cut him off with a voice that commanded the room in ways Dante never could. A voice that carried the weight of someone who died and chosen to come back. And she said, "I'm not here as Dante's wife or his victim. I'm here as the woman who's been systematically destroying his empire for 3 months, and I'm here to offer each of you a choice. Stand with a man who's been lying to you for years, or stand with the truth that's about to bury him." Isabella opened the briefcase and distributed folders to each family head, evidence that Dante had been skimming from their operations, that he'd made deals with federal prosecutors to sacrifice their soldiers in exchange for his own immunity, that he'd been planning to eliminate them one by one and take control of the entire eastern seaboard. And Selene watched as the men who'd built their lives on loyalty and honor realized they'd been protecting a traitor who saw them as obstacles rather than allies. The most surprising twist came not from Selene's evidence, but from an unexpected source when Sophia Drago, Dante's 17-year-old daughter, who everyone assumed was just another privileged Mafia princess, walked into the room and stood beside Selene. And she addressed her father with a coldness that suggested she'd inherited more than just his last name. "I know what you did to Selene. I've known for 3 years. I found her blood on your clothes the night you came home and told me she'd abandoned us. And I've been waiting for the day when someone would finally make you pay for turning our family into a nightmare built on lies and murder." Sophia revealed that she'd been the one feeding information to Isabella, that she'd been Selene's silent ally from the beginning, that watching her father become a monster had taught her that blood didn't excuse evil, and family didn't mean blind loyalty. And she placed a recording device on the table that contained Dante's own voice, bragging to his inner circle about killing Selene and their unborn child, about how eliminating his pregnant wife had been necessary to maintain his reputation for ruthlessness. And suddenly, every person in that room understood they were looking at a man who'd murdered his own family for power. Alessandro used every skill he'd developed as an FBI agent and undercover operative to systematically dismantle Dante's defenses, presenting evidence that would hold up in federal court, testimony from witnesses Dante thought he'd silenced, financial records that proved decades of criminal enterprise. And he did it with the precision of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment, who'd transformed personal tragedy into professional excellence. And he made sure everyone in that room understood that Dante wasn't just losing his empire. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison, where his name and reputation meant nothing. Selene showed herself at her most heroic and authentic when she finally addressed Dante directly, not with rage or hatred, but with something far more devastating, a calm certainty that came from someone who'd survived the unsurvivable and emerged stronger. "You shot me 22 times because you thought I was weak, thought love made me vulnerable, thought being your wife meant I belonged to you. But every bullet you put in me just proved that you never understood what strength really was. You never understood that the woman you loved was always stronger than the monster you became. And now, I'm going to do something you never could. I'm going to walk away from you alive while you lose everything. And that's a mercy you never gave me." The justice came not from Selene pulling a trigger, but from watching federal agents storm the room with warrants for Dante's arrest. From seeing the 5 family heads turn their backs on him and dissolve their alliances with the Drago family. From Sophia choosing to testify against her own father because she understood that real family meant protecting the innocent, not enabling the guilty. And from Dante's face as he realized that Selene hadn't just survived his attempt to kill her, she'd transformed his greatest act of violence into the catalyst for his complete destruction. The emotional payoff came when Alessandro took Selene's hand as federal agents led Dante away in handcuffs, when Victor appeared in the doorway leaning on a cane, but alive and grinning. When Isabella handed Selene the keys to Dante's casino and said, "I believe this belongs to the Queen now," and Selene felt something she hadn't felt since before the warehouse, something that felt like freedom, like the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by the past. Like maybe the woman who'd crawled out of her grave could finally start living instead of just surviving. Selene looked at Dante one last time as agents pushed him toward the door, and she said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You tried to make me a ghost, but instead you created a queen, and that's the last mistake you'll ever make." And then she turned away from him forever, turned toward Alessandro and Sophia and Victor and Isabella, turned toward the family she'd chosen rather than the one that had tried to destroy her. And she smiled because she'd done what everyone said was impossible. She'd taken 22 bullets and turned them into a crown. Comment below what you think Selene should do with Dante's empire, and smash that subscribe button, because the epilogue is going to blow your mind. 6 months after Dante's arrest, Selene stood on the balcony of what used to be his penthouse office, now transformed into the headquarters of the Resurrection Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and organized crime rebuild their lives. And she watched the sunrise over the city that had once been her graveyard and was now her kingdom. Not the kingdom of fear and violence that Dante had ruled, but something better. Something built on second chances and the radical belief that surviving could become thriving if you had the right support. The growth and change showed most clearly in how Selene carried herself now. The way she'd stopped hiding her scars and started wearing them as badges of honor. The way she'd learned that strength wasn't about becoming hard and untouchable, but about being vulnerable enough to accept help and love. And she'd discovered that the woman who died in that warehouse wasn't someone to mourn, but someone to honor by becoming the person that frightened girl had always had the potential to be. Someone who used power to protect rather than dominate. Someone who understood that real queens lifted others up rather than standing on their broken backs. Alessandro had left the FBI to become the Foundation's Director of Security and Legal Advocacy, using his law enforcement connections to help survivors navigate the justice system that too often failed them. And the way he and Selene worked together showed how their relationship had evolved from desperate attraction, born of shared trauma, into genuine partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. The kind of love that didn't need drama or danger to sustain it, but thrived in the quiet moments of building something meaningful together, and watching him teach self-defense classes to women who'd survived. What Selene had survived made her fall in love with him all over again every single day. The romantic subplot reached its fulfilling conclusion, not with a dramatic proposal, but with a simple moment, 3 months after Dante's conviction, when Alessandro found Selene working late in her office and said, "I don't need you to be my wife, or wear my ring, or take my name. I just need you to know that every morning I wake up grateful that you survived, that you chose to come back, that you let me be part of your second life, and whatever we call this thing between us, it's the realest thing I've ever known." And Selena kissed him and whispered, "I spent 3 years planning revenge, and it took me that long to realize that the best revenge wasn't destroying Dante. It was building a life so beautiful that what he did to me became just a chapter in my story, instead of the whole book. And you're the reason I know what beautiful feels like now." Sofia Drago had legally changed her name to Sofia Castellano, reclaiming her mother's maiden name and her own identity, separate from her father's legacy. And she'd become Celine's protege, and the Foundation's youngest board member, using her insider knowledge of organized crime to help law enforcement dismantle the systems that had protected men like Dante for generations. And the relationship between Selene and Sofia had evolved into something like mother and daughter, the family they'd both lost to Dante's violence, reconstructed in a form neither had expected, but both desperately needed. Victor had fully recovered from his injuries and now ran the Foundation's security operations, training other survivors to protect themselves and others. And he'd found unexpected romance with Isabella Gatsby, who'd decided that a life of corporate espionage was less fulfilling than using her skills to expose corruption and protect the vulnerable. And watching them together, two people who'd built walls around their hearts, finding the courage to let someone in, reminded Selene that love came in many forms, and all of them were worth fighting for. The loose ends tied up beautifully when the last of Dante's corrupt officials were prosecuted. When the 5 families agreed to a peace treaty that included provisions for going legitimate and ending the cycles of violence that had defined organized crime for generations. When Sofia testified at her father's sentencing hearing and told the judge, "My father taught me that power means never showing weakness, but Selene taught me that real power means having the strength to be vulnerable, to admit when you're wrong, to choose growth over ego. And I hope my father spends his life in prison, learning what he tried to kill in all of us. That love isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes us human. The sense of new beginnings manifested when Selene discovered she was pregnant. A development that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, because it meant confronting the ghost of the child she'd lost. But Alessandro held her while she cried and said, "This isn't replacing what Dante took from you. This is proof that he didn't win, that life continues, that you're not just surviving anymore, you're living, really living. And our child is going to grow up knowing that their mother is the strongest person who ever lived, because she turned 22 bullets into a crown and chose love over hate." And Selene realized that the baby growing inside her wasn't a reminder of what she'd lost, but a promise of what she'd gained, a future that Dante's bullets couldn't touch. The story ended, not with Selene looking back at the warehouse where she'd died, but looking forward to the life she'd built from its ashes. Standing on that balcony with Alessandro's arms around her and their future literally growing inside her, and she thought about the woman who'd crawled out of her grave 3 years ago, broken and furious and desperate for revenge. And she wished she could tell that woman that the journey would be worth it, that the pain would transform into purpose, that the scars would become stories of survival rather than shame, and that the best revenge against the man who tried to destroy her wasn't his destruction, but her resurrection. Not as the ghost he'd created, but as the queen she'd chosen to become. And that was a victory no one could ever take away. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment about your favorite moment and subscribe to Stella's Love Tales for more stories where power meets passion and love conquers all.